back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Dr. Michael Brenes. He's the co-director of the Bridget Johnson Program in Grant Strategy at Yale University. Uh, today, we're discussing his book, which focuses on how the great power competition presents a threat to democracies. This is a bit of a provocative topic. Uh, uh, the title of the book is called The Rivalry Peril: How Great Power Competition Threatens Peace and Weakens Democracy, and it was just published by the Yale University Press. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to get into this, what promises to be a very thought-provoking conversation. But before we get into it, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, the program on Grand Strategy, and for those in the audience who may not be entirely sure what grand strategy is, could you define what the word is? A lot of the time I find people don't understand what the word strategy itself means, much less grand strategy.
Sure. So first, thanks for having me. So I teach in the Grand Strategy program, as you mentioned. I also teach in the history department at Yale. I am a historian by training, so I specialize particularly in 20th century U.S. history, focusing primarily on U.S. foreign policy and its relationship to domestic politics in the 20th century. My first book was on the role of Cold War defense spending and how it shaped American politics, and of course, therefore, how it shaped American power and its projection abroad. But I was really interested in sort of the ways in which the material connections and ideological connections that are established through a permanent military industry, how that shapes American politics. I then have, through the Grand Strategy program, been able to focus more on contemporary issues. And so hence the book that and also allowed me to do a lot of co-authorship and collaboration across disciplines. Grand strategy first, I'll define in a bit, but grand strategy for me is interdisciplinary first and foremost. So it brings together, I mean, I'm a historian again by training, but it brings together political scientists, economists, people from various backgrounds to understand strategy and strategy making. So that allowed me to collaborate, I think, with a variety of different people, including my co-author for this book, Ben Jackson, who's a political scientist. So we came out with an article in Foreign Affairs in July of 2022, and that became the basis for this book that was just published in January. And I'm now currently working single. It's my no co-author for this book, but I'm currently working on a project on the history of the War on Terror, trying to understand the War on Terror as an epoch in both U.S. but also global history, and how American policymakers responded to the threat of terrorism and how that response then shaped an entire 30-year, I'm arguing a 30-year period of history from 1993, from the World Trade Center attack in 1993 to basically the Biden administration. And so that's my project. In terms of grand strategy, we define grand strategy in broad terms in the program. So the program first brings together students within Yale. You can be an undergraduate or a graduate student from a PhD program or with professional schools. Students have to apply to get into the program. So they apply around the fall, October, November. And from those applications, we select finalists and we pick around 20 to 25 students to be admitted in the program. All the students in the program, again, they come from very different majors, they come from very different backgrounds. Grand strategy being interdisciplinary, but they have all of them have a vision of change, whether that may be in the realm of foreign policy, whether it's U.S.-China relations or Ukraine, or whether that's in domestic politics related to racial justice or inequality in various forms in the United States, or maybe it's more sort of a global issue. There are many students in the program who are interested in climate change, in issues of development, of issues of democracy in global terms, not just in terms of American democracy and its future. So that allows us to bring together various students from the university, from various disciplines. That allows us to define grand strategy in very capacious terms. We use John Lewis Gaddis's definition of grand strategy. Professor Gaddis John was a co-director and co-founder of the program in Grand Strategy at Yale. And Professor Gaddis John defines it as the application of limited means to unlimited ends. And so if you're thinking about grand strategy, first, the temporal scope being uh, not just within the next 2 to 3 or 4 years, but maybe even the next 5, 10, 20 years, thinking long term about strategy and thinking about applying every strategist or every person who thinks about creating change in the world, which I think is a better way of putting it, has limited means. They don't have unlimited funds. They don't have unlimited personnel. They have to think about applying limited means to unlimited ends because the ends haven't been defined yet. Certainly, if you're not thinking about if you're talking or operating in a 10 to 20 year time frame. But I think within that framework, you have a goal. You have a goal in mind, and that is true. I think whether we're talking about, again, U.S.-China relations, whether we're talking about racial justice, whether we're talking about uh, climate change in general. And so I think the program is an effort to try to get students to think critically about strategy, both in historical terms. It's a year-long program. We have first semesters in the spring. We focus on strategy in historical terms, and then the summer, we have a project, and then in the fall, they have a much more contemporary focus on issues that are going on now. And I think that's what's valuable and very rare about the program is that we are bringing in together again, a variety of different students thinking about strategy in complex terms and trying to get people to think critically and with humility about what they can do to shape the world for the better.
Now, I'm going to start with a little bit of a provocative question. Can
Sure.
the United States government really have a great strategy given that it changes every 4 to 8 years and given the extreme level of polarization that we are seeing today?
I think the United States can have a grand strategy. I think grand strategy has often been within the realm of foreign policy, almost exclusively within the realm of foreign policy. I think that is understandably the norm. I do think, though, that if we're um, seeing how things play out, and again, using our definition of grand strategy, that I think the federal government, the United States government, can have a grand strategy for issues like climate change, or can have issues to grand strategy for issues again like inequality. I think certainly someone like FDR, for instance, had a grand strategy for foreign policy that materialized during World War II. But I also think he had a grand strategy for tackling inequality and tackling unemployment and tackling poverty at home. Certainly in the 1930s, in the wake of the Great Depression, when he took office in 1933, I think he had a strategy for dealing with those things. And that, I think, is also apparent in someone like Lyndon Johnson, who I'm not so sure had a grand strategy for foreign policy, but had a very clear strategy for domestic politics and domestic policy. And his war on poverty and his Great Society comes out of that. So I do think that the United States can have a grand strategy. I do think, though, to your point, it's hard to enact a strategy over a 2 to 4 year timeline. And I think that's why within domestic policy, it's particularly hard because the major periods of reform in the country have really been two. One was the 1933 to 1937, and from really 1963 to 1967, kind of around in the Johnson Kennedy years. And that's because of the makeup of Congress. It's because of the makeup of the judiciary. It's because of a variety of different things. But I think in terms of foreign policy, even though you can argue that George Kennan had a grand strategy for taking on containment, that strategy got distorted and perverted in his view. That the United States didn't need to go around building military bases around the world. It didn't need, in his view, in Kennan's view, didn't need to go around and try to stamp out communism in Africa or even parts of Asia. He had a more limited vision of containment and containing communism, and that's due to, again, I think, the evolution of politics in the country and global politics as well, but also the makeup of administrations and how they thought about applying this grand vision. So I think it's incumbent upon, I would say it's incumbent upon certainly people like Biden who had, I think, again, a vision for foreign policy and a vision for domestic policy. It's incumbent upon people like Biden to articulate a grand strategy, which they arguably didn't do, I think, for the most part. And then they also, it's incumbent upon them to try to figure out, to address this, the second part of my point, figure out how they overcome those obstacles. Again, if you're talking about limited means and limited ends, like how do you think about overcoming partisan politics, sort of blatant, attempts to uh, um, obscure or try to prevent policy decisions being made by the opposition. I think that's also important um, for presidents and for policymakers in general.
Indeed, especially given that Congress tends to switch every couple of years and tends to
True,
very much become an obstacle for whichever party dominates the White House.
true.
That brings me to the idea of your book about great power competition and how it can actually hurt democracy. So let's start with looking at what great power competition is. Usually, when people talk about it, they seem to define U.S., possibly UK or European Union,
Hmm.
and Russia and or China or both of them together. Is it still the case?
Yeah, I think that's mostly true. Great power competition, I think, is focused primarily on the United States and China. And we talk about great power competition between these two superpowers or great powers over access to influence and to resources, to markets, to spheres of influence, if you want to call it that. That's been kind of back in vogue in the wake of great power competition becoming our norm. But I think also you do get, because of the ways in which great power competition is framed, you do get Russia thrown in there as well. You know, that the United States is also engaged in a competition over Russia's attempts to intervene in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, and what that's done to reshape great power competition. Um, that has provoked then debates about whether Russia is a great power, et cetera. And then therefore on the sort of US side and the US allied side, the UK gets and Germany gets kind of wrapped up in this as well. Sort of thinking about, again, when we're talking about Russia, where do the Europeans get involved in this question, European security? And so competition, therefore, to our point in the book, is that it's just sort of a totalizing concept. So you just can't get out of it even if you want to, because it's kind of rearranging the world, and everyone has to kind of pick a side, even if they don't want to pick a side. And I think there are many countries, as we saw in the wake of the Ukraine invasion, particularly in the global South, who don't want to take sides in Africa and in Asia. But I think yes, competition is ultimately defined by, or when people think about U.S. great power competition, it's defined by the U.S.-China relationship, but then other powers get subsumed into it depending upon the issue and depending upon, um, again, the impact of great power competition for the rest of the world.
Given that we are seeing a realigning of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea into an axis, can this traditional great power competition view of competing or with single states and single modalities change the way this rearrangement of alliances uh, takes place? On the one hand, you correctly pointed out that countries do not necessarily want to take sides, say between the U.S. and China or between US and Russia. But if Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together against the West, even if their specific goals may be divergent or in fact at odds with each other on some level, do these countries that may have a problem with Russia but not a problem with China, or a problem with Iran but not a problem with someone else, can do they still, to what extent does that color the choice now, given this framework? Looking at it as a nexus as opposed to individual countries.
Yeah, what I think you're describing is what I think we have, which is a multipolar world, right? That various countries can have influence in this world in ways that they couldn't in a bipolar, or certainly unipolar framework. And then again, I think the Ukraine invasion is an indication of that. I think it's also just in terms of economic terms, a multipolar world. Looking at the economic numbers and access to sort of things like strategic minerals. And just in great power terms, if you want to put it in that framework of great power competition, India, a rising power, is going to be the third largest economy in the world by 2030. And there are, of course, then efforts by the United States and by China to kind of pull India into its orbit. And India is resisting that, which has historically been the case for a country like India going back to the early years of the Cold War. And I think that's what you're describing. I think our problem with great power competition then is that it's trying to, well, one, it's anachronistic in general terms. It's trying to force our multipolar world into a bipolar framework, and that's just not the case. And two, to your point, I think, yes, I think there's obviously clear collaborations between Russia, Iran, and North Korea and China that aren't good for the world. Sending North Korean troops into Ukraine, right, I think is an indication of this collaboration. But it remains to be seen how the endurance of this collaboration and its strength, like how long will it hold, and what are the conditions in which this axis, if you want to call it that, this axis of upheaval, as it's been called, will endure. And I think that's a question mark right now, given what Trump is doing in regards to his Russia policy in Ukraine. I certainly think, though, that there's a strong anti-West sentiment among these countries, and that's not going to go away. But the question is, again, will that be enough for will that hold, and will that be enough to be a sufficient challenge to America and its allies? I don't know. And then just a final point, I think, in regards to this being a multipolar world and not a bipolar world, I think that, to your points as well, that it remains to be seen as to how much the United States can influence the outcome of behavior in many parts of the world that it doesn't like, and I think in certain cases where you said like the Philippines and other cases as well, where the United States is trying to sway a country one way or the other, I'm not so sure how much, again, internally, great power competition as a framework will be useful for getting the United States to change regime behavior. It's certainly not changing Chinese behavior at the moment, and I don't think it's going to change the countries who are so-called fence sitters or who are
Mhm.
in a position where they just, again, don't want to, they want to extract what they want from the United States. They want to benefit from this as much as possible, but they don't want to take clear sides because that's not advantageous to them and their position in the world.
Well, to some extent, in some limited instances, and it was possible, and it was a bipartisan issue. For instance, the U.S., both under Biden and now under Trump, managed to force UAE into moving away from tech exchanges with China by essentially creating a stronger relationship, partnership conditioned on that move. Uh,
Sure.
whether that's possible across the board, I don't know, but this is
Correct.
one
Correct.
specific instance where there was a limited success, at least.
Correct.
But here's a question that I'm struggling with, and I haven't really seen addressed very clearly. To what extent is it possible or desirable to separate national security or generally international security concerns from purely economic or geopolitical resource-oriented issues? Because you would think that those two are intertwined, and it makes almost logical sense that when you're talking about resources, of course, they have to do with security concerns, with defense production, with basic access to resources that you need to keep your economy going. Of course it's a security matter. But if you look at the Trump administration and the way it has presented its strategies, they seem to be entirely focused on purely economic rivalry and seems to downplay the security aspect of these tensions. Is that a workable solution? Is it something that's actually possible to do? Should we be doing it?
Separating economic issues from national security issues.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about Trump. I think Trump sees U.S. foreign policy in purely, resource terms. The United States, in his view, and I mean, I'm trying to empathize with Trump here, trying to at least understand Trump. And I think in his view, given his statements and given the people around him, it's that these countries, whether it's Canada or Mexico or whether it's China or whether it's France, that they owe the United States. They owe the United States resources. They owe, they should be grateful for the United States and what it's done, and that the arrangements that we've set up with these countries in over decades has not been beneficial to the United States in his view, and he wants to, I think, in his mind, create more better, more equal circumstances, or really not just equal. He wants stuff from these countries in ways that advantage the United States and disadvantages them. And so that is purely to your point. I don't think Trump sees the world in purely extractive terms. Like I
Mhm,
want this stuff, please give it to me, or I'll just give it, or I'll just take it, and then he's going to see how far he can go, right?
mhm.
You can see him walking back the tariffs, right, as relates to Mexico, and then the stock market, will I think this has already happened, but the stock market is going to take a significant hit going forward as it relates to the impact of these tariffs on China. I think that's also gonna be bad, and we'll see if he walks these tariffs back as a result. I think I'm talking about like 25% tariffs. Have been tariffs on Chinese goods for quite some time now, going back to the first Trump administration, but they haven't been detrimental to the economy at this point. And I think that's what's going to transpire. So I don't think, to answer your question, I mean, I think countries have always, when we're talking about great power competition, and I think this is our problem with great power competition, is that it is about sort of even though the United States, American policymakers don't talk about this, like great power competition, imagines spheres of influence and taking over areas of influence, then that is purely in resource terms and military terms. And I don't think that's a great posture for creating the kinds of or just creating stability, and it doesn't create stability, it exacerbates instability, and creating kind of conditions we need at this moment in our politics, when again, in a multipolar world, competition over things like climate change doesn't work. But that's the problem, is that I would argue, to your point, that separating economic from national security issues would be great on an issue like climate change, because we need to be sharing our resources cooperatively,
Mhm.
and so the richest countries need to be doing that. They need to be sharing the resources, but that's not the framework we're in. We're in this framework of, you know, Trump, like, I want things from these countries, give it to me, and I will make sure that through coercion or through constraining them or through the threat of even conquering them, in the case of something like Canada, where he says Canada is going to be the 51st state, like those types of, as crazy as that sounds, those types of measures again reflect this larger impetus to take areas of the world, and put them in the U.S. orbit, and say, like, well, this is a reflection, therefore, of our dominance and our role in the world, and therefore we can constrain China, we constrain other competitors, and we must remain number one at all costs. And I don't think that's the world that we need right now.
So getting back to this idea of great power competition, weakening democracy, undermining peace, one of the things you started your book with was an incident involving Steve Bannon of all people, and
Yes.
underscoring underscoring the seeming agreement between Democrats and Republicans that China presents a unique threat. You also criticize this attitude because it tried to use a Cold War framework and fit it into the current China paradigm. So what in could you elaborate what in your opinion is wrong with that?
Well, I'll start with sort of the um, historical framework, and we can sort of get into some of the contemporary. It's a big
Mm-hmm.
question. So I think first, the ways in which the uh, framework of great power competition has been or has materialized and created, I would argue, has everything to do, or not everything, but a large portion or great responsibility of it has to do with how policymakers imagine the first Cold War ending. So we're supposedly in a new Cold War with China, that whether they reject it or not, many of the Biden administration of folks rejected the idea that we're in a new Cold War with China, but they accepted much of the framework of a Cold War.
Hmm.
They didn't use the language. That implies that the first Cold War was essentially something to reflect upon and be proud of in some way. That is to say that American policymakers, when I think about the Cold War, and this was happening in the Trump administration and into the Biden administration, where policymakers, particularly in the Democratic side of things, were saying, like, look at the Cold War metaphor and look at what we did. We constrained the Soviet Union. We allowed the Soviet Union to collapse. It was a long period of peace. This idea of the long peace, which is, I think, still very much in vogue within many policymaking circles. And the Soviet Union collapsed and communism fell, and you had this unipolar era that was a kind of period of peace, which allows you to kind of skirt over the war on terror. But then great power competition comes, and oh gosh, we're back into old frameworks. And so that's one thing that's happening. Is sort of the historical memory of the Cold War as well. It was a not a good war, but it was a war that led to good outcomes for the United States and policymakers. And we can just kind of take what's good from the Cold War, that is, the lessons are constraining an enemy, containing the Soviet Union. Maybe if we contain China, maybe if we can create an autarkic China. The rhetoric about decoupling from China, I think, is related to this. Then we can have a peaceful outcome. The end, I don't think, though, is very clear. Like, what is the end of, I think we had a good sense of what the end of the Cold War was like. What's the end of the Second Cold War? I don't know. Is it the fall of Xi Jinping? Is it,
Hmm.
some sort of change of leadership? Setting that aside, though, I think that's a problem. But I think that's the first sort of thing of how we sort of think about of like a Cold War or the Great Power Competition, like sort of coming out of the Cold War as a historical framework. And then I think it's this idea of like, well, competition in and of itself has just sort of become our future. It's like we can't get out of it. Like, if that's the framework, then everything else has to sort of follow from the fact that we're in this great power competition, and whatever we want to achieve, whether that's domestically or internationally, has to fall in with this framework. That is to say, if the United States is indeed locked in a long-term competition with China, then we have to take that into account in terms of how we think about spending on the welfare state or spending on certain things. And you see this reflected in the rhetoric of the Biden administration or in the rhetoric of the Trump administration now, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said, we need to retool our focus and make it that great power competition with China is what we're preoccupied with, which is something that the Biden administration said, but in different terms. And I think that locks us into, again, a protracted conflict that, if you look at the first Cold War, wasn't very good for the world. That led to the deaths of millions of people. Domestically in the United States, you have constraints on free speech, delays in social justice. The fall of the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson was due to the Vietnam War. In historical terms, domestic politics gets sacrificed to foreign war, and I think that's the um, historical problem. It's that it's the wrong historical framing of the Cold War. And then two, to my point about sort of, well, then if we're locked in this Cold War, then we can't get out of it. I think then it's a situation where we're not defining the ends of what we want from this. What exactly does this mean? And we just kind of keep perpetuating this cycle or this idea of competition without understanding what exactly is our grand strategy and where exactly are we going. And so it's detrimental to peace, it's detrimental to democracy, and it's detrimental to the long-term well-being, economic and otherwise, of people in the United States and abroad. I think that's too much, but I'll stop there for now.
I'm not entirely sure that we are in fact trying to use to apply the Soviet strategy to China for one simple reason. Ronald Reagan, for all his shortcomings and whether you agree with his strategy or not, did have a clear objective of what he wanted to accomplish, and he had clear benchmarks for success, and he had very clear tactics
Hmm.
and goals in achieving them. And we can argue, and a lot of people, including Reagan supporters, do argue about all of that, but it's clear that the goal was, by the way, entirely Soviet Union. China was not really part of that equation. That's one reason why I find this whole analogy problematic to begin with. The fact that the Cold War was so Soviet and Soviet bloc centric and almost entirely left out the China angle of it. And the Vietnam War was a tangent, but precisely because there was never a clear China strategy that made Vietnam such a mess for everyone involved. So that's
Hmm.
uh, that raises a question: can we fight? Can we have a grand strategy without a clear objective? Because as you rightly mentioned, I don't see that we have a clear objective with regard to China, whereas Russia and China both do have very clear objectives of what they want to see at the end of the day. And it might not be anything we like, but I do think they have a very clear view of it.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't think we have a clear objective as it relates to China. I don't, and I think this is something that uh, people who are critical of great power competition need to press policymakers on. It's like, okay, so what's the goal here? Is the goal to see the collapse of Xi Jinping's regime? And I mean that both in terms of okay, Xi being ousted as leader of China, as a dictator, Xi being ousted and replaced with another dictator, is not just going to keep perpetuating this cycle. Right? It's
Sure.
going to keep perpetuating competition. Now, maybe that dictator is more less nationalistic, less hyper focused on. I think as Xi is his own personal historical legacy. Um, Maybe that's the case, but that's also not been historically true in terms of like the fall of a nationalistic dictator doesn't necessarily lead to someone who's willing to open the doors to democracy and peace. And this is again sort of where the Cold War framework is coming in. I think people are imagining, well, if Xi goes, then we're
Mhm.
going to get someone who's more aligned with American values or American interests. We don't need necessarily to be aligned with American values. I think that'd be ideal, but more of American interests and allowing the United States to have a say in the South China Sea and and not interfering in American supply chains, et cetera, commerce, et cetera. I don't think that's necessarily the case given what Xi has done to reshape the Politburo. I don't think that's actually the case. So that's one thing that I think needs to be questioned. Then the other thing that's thinking about is sort of okay, if the end is the collapse of the Chinese state altogether, like this, like CCP needs
Mhm.
to just fall apart, and then there's going to be a new democratic regime that comes out of that. That's going to destabilize, certainly East Asia, but because of China's role in
Why
the
should it
world.
destabilize East Asia? I mean, if you have something like Taiwan but on a much bigger scale, shouldn't it actually stabilize East Asia and prevent unhealthy uh, rivalry over borders and things like that?
But this is my
Instead,
point in terms
hmm
in terms of in terms of what destabilization takes. Like so if it's destabilization to the point of creating a vacuum, then that's bad.
hmm
If it's destabilization that leads to a democratic regime, okay, that's we can live with that. But
sure.
again, that's to my point, that's unlikely that that's going to happen.
hmm
And then this is the other side of this too, is that there's the economic component, which is that I don't necessarily want to see like we shouldn't be trying to decouple from China and put it into a box because of China's role in the global economy. It's not just that the United States is intertwined with the Chinese economy. It's, again, many parts of the global South are intertwined with the Chinese economy. And these countries rely upon China for various things, whether, again, it may be, and indeed in many cases is, an exploitative relationship, whether that's through the Belt and Road Initiative or whether other types of exploitative relationships with China. But destabilizing China to the point that it's going to lead to an economic crisis in China, there's already economic issues in China in terms of the unemployment crisis, et cetera. That's going to have ripple effects that are going to affect American workers, and that's going to affect overall the health of the global economy. And I think that's going to create conditions in these parts of the global South that aren't um, that don't have stable regimes, or that are, facing corrupt regimes, or are facing lots of sovereign debt, or that are facing various crises, that's going to lead to, again, more crises in those parts of the world. That's going to foment problems globally. And I think that's the problem that's currently not, or that's not in this sort of relationship of or understanding of competition, is that this has global effects, and not just like the US benefits and China loses. So that this says China loses on certain terms, then it's going to have negative repercussions for the rest of the globe in ways that I don't think we've considered. And I think that's the kind of analysis that I think we need. I think the best case scenario, obviously, is that Z falls and the CCP falls and the democratic regime comes. Like, okay, that's fantastic and great and good. Like, no threats to Taiwan, right? Better relationships with the world, right? You were back to kind of like a Pax Americana unipolar moment, perhaps. But I don't think that's likely to happen. But I think that's what policymakers want to see, even though I don't think that's realistic or therefore possible.
So one of the reasons I'm sensing a reluctance to define clear objectives is that no one wants to discuss the costs of what it will take. Everyone
Correct.
prefers to float by, and this is what we've been seeing with Ukraine. No one
Correct.
actually defined what it would cost to decisively win the war. I'm not talking about clear borders and objectives, military objectives. I think those are as clear as anything. Getting Russia out of Ukraine is a very clear military objective. I'm talking about how much it would cost and from whom to make sure that it happens. So no one has actually discussed that clearly, and so we are endlessly playing the numbers, and we are finding itself in a situation where it's very easy to manipulate public opinion. With China, it's even worse than that because here no one wants to uh, create any objectives whatsoever because then you have to assess the risks, you have to assess the cost, and you have to assess what it takes to reach every benchmark during the Soviet-oriented Cold War. I would argue we were all in the sense of we were willing to match Soviet Union dollar for ruble, and we were
Hmm.
willing to try to bankrupt Soviet Union
Hmm.
with SDI and so forth at a point, and we had a clear definition of rolling back, first containing and then rolling back influence and what that would mean, and we were willing to partner with whoever we needed to partner with to make that happen. Now the situation is different, first of all, because there are additional threats. You have jihadist movements, you have
Hmm.
other assorted, separate threads, and some of them are related threads. The other issues, the new isolationism makes external costs extremely unpopular, undesirable, or they're being sold as unpopular and undesirable, which, in terms of actual decision making, is the same thing, even though it's actually quite different.
Hmm.
Um, so what we are not willing to do is invest what needs to be invested to match China, for instance. Forget even military objectives. I'm talking about purely economic. We were just talking about Panama, uh, and Donald Trump. Trump made demands on Panama to cut off access to Chinese businesses, and supposedly Panama decided not to renew BRI. But what about all the businesses already in place? Is US going to match those dollar for dollar? They're not. So the
Hmm.
question is, what would it take for us to actually economically come anywhere near pushing China out of their spheres of influence wherever they may be?
Well, that's my point. Is I think it's a futile effort to do that. I mean, the cost is one thing. I would think about the cost in different terms. Is that you can try to constrain China, you can decouple, you can try to decouple, you can try to marginalize China as much as you can, but in the end, I don't think it's going to make a significant impact um, on China as a power. And this is my point about external constraints on internal behavior. The Biden administration, for instance, on AI, tried to prevent China from developing something like DeepSeek. It did everything it could to export controls, I'm sorry, place export controls on technology, and that failed. And I think that's an indication to me of like, well, the United States did what it thought it could do, and when did all it could do, as it thought it could, and then beyond just sort of, you know, I don't know what more you could have done, just in terms of then intervening in the Chinese economy and it's like cyber attacks and things like that. But I don't know. But then that didn't work. And I think to me that the larger point is that if China is going to be in a position where I think as it currently is, it's facing a bunch of crises, economic crises, internal crises, the real estate market, right? The unemployment, youth unemployment crises. There's all sorts of crises that are happening. The United States trying to speed that up through investing heavily in its military, investing heavily in its in tariffs and other things is actually not going to, I think, create altogether the outcome that the United States wants, right? So
Mhm.
it's one, it's like you're not creating the outcome that you want, and two, even if you do create this outcome of well, you've destabilized the Chinese economy to the point that it's in a period of crisis, the result to me is not like then the Xi Jinping goes to the United States and says, oh, how can capitulates to them and like how can we help you like he can't he as a nationalist himself is going to then rely upon his own nationalism to say look at what the Americans are doing to us, look at the position that they're put us in, which is what he's been doing to his own people, and use that as propaganda to further fuel his hold on power. And I think the question of cost, therefore, is not just like, okay, how many dollars and cents does it take for the United States to be in a position
Mhm.
where it's further constraining China? It's like the cost is like long-term stability and long-term, global stability. I mean, not just stability in the United States and China, but long-term stability in ways that would benefit the world. And I think that is really the unknown. But again, the outcomes of which, even if they're unknown, uh, both in historical and contemporary terms, I don't think are going to be altogether beneficial for the United States, given the things that I've already outlined, if that makes sense.
So let's talk about agency. I think there's been a huge bias in U.S. foreign policy circles of either side. Democrats and Republicans both have made that mistake of assuming that every other country's foreign policy is merely a response to what U.S. is or isn't doing, which, in my opinion, is a very erroneous assumption. Let's put aside how U.S. is viewing great power competition. Let's assume that the decision makers leave aside the Soviet paradigm of trying to constrain China. China proceeds to do what it wants to do anyway, with no constraints whatsoever. Let's say we put aside talk about decoupling, just let China
Mhm.
be and see what happens. And we've seen that when left to its own devices, it hasn't become any more pro-American than when we are putting pressure. In other words, Xi and any dictator really will use propaganda either way. If
Sure.
somebody, if there is no response, he will interpret it as weakness. If there is a response, he will interpret it for internal propaganda purposes as a sign of aggression. If there is an attempt to compromise, he will try to exploit it in a dishonest way, because he's not particularly constrained by the rules-based order. So regardless of what US does or doesn't do on whichever path it material uses, if someone is not committed to the rule of law and is not committed to normal boundaries, um, it's going to be irrelevant what type of action US or other democratic countries engage in. So the question is, what do we do with countries where the leadership is not only is willing to violate the rules-based order and is not willing to be constrained by normal parameters, the way democracies operate and interact with each other?
Well, there's lots of countries that do that. There's lots of
Well,
countries I mean, India does that too. I mean, India violates human rights in its own, it relies upon nationalism or ethno-nationalism to for
yeah,
Modi to
so
solidify his rule.
so
Go ahead.
let's say we assume that the point where the red line for us is when the country starts exporting its internal practices outside its own borders. I'm not saying that that should be the norm, I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about human rights internally, quite the opposite. But let's say the absolute red line is exportation of this violation of rules outside, meaning violent territorial disputes with its neighbors, meaning stealing of intellectual property, meaning importation of active measures, espionage, police station. In other words, everything China is already doing, and of course
Sure.
extremely aggressive competition that is yeah, that breaks the rules of normal economic investment and competition, as we've seen time and time again. So let's say we have this parameter that's way outside internal matters, that there is absolutely no way to police 100% by any one country. Let's say it starts interfering with the external order and with the way other countries conduct their relations. W- what should be done then? To what extent, if the Soviet paradigm of
Mhm.
containment or rollback doesn't work, if decoupling or putting sorts of pressure brings these undesirable costs, but on the other hand, if you don't do them, those costs come up from a different angle. How should we make? How should we ensure that peace and democracy are preserved? If if what we do exacerbates the issue, and if we don't do anything, the issue comes along on its own terms. What should we be doing?
Yeah, so I think you're so I go back to what we say in the book is that it's not that China poses no threat, right?
Sure.
I mean, that China poses a series of threats, that some that you've articulated, which is that, um, cyber attacks, property theft, human rights violations, all sorts. I mean, the international legal drug trade, all sorts of problems, that China poses to the world. I think, though, we can take those threats on as threats. Like, we don't have to take them on as everything that happens under China is a signal that we need to compete with China for forever, and need to be locked in a long-term struggle, existential struggle, as American policymakers see it many times, over the fate of freedom in the world. Right? That there are various countries, as you've described, including the United States, who break the rules of rules-based order when it suits their interest. That's what great powers do. The United States has done that in terms of violating WTO and other types of international economic laws or rules when it suits their interest. Question is, though, does it pose an existential threat to freedom? Freedom, obviously, the United States would say no. China, when it violates certain types of international law, I think, does those violations pose an existential threat to freedom? I think we should weigh in those cases and say, like, okay, is this going to affect the world in ways that need to be met with some sort of harsh measure as a response? And I think, we'd have to take on those threats as individual, also collective ones. But that doesn't mean we have to sort of say, well, the Chinese regime itself, and whatever China does, or China as a country, is in a position where it needs to be constrained because of its violations um, of cyber attacks and its violations of intellectual property law. And I think that's how we were dealing with China for many years. That's how we were dealing with China under the Bush administration and the Obama administration, and then things started to change, I think, under Xi. But that response to Xi was also a response within the American government of, like, oh, how do we sort of think about the China threat in bigger terms? So my point then is sort of to say, well, if competition as a framework is just everything's being subsumed under is not great. And I don't think just leave China to its own devices, or any country can be left to its own devices in an interconnected global economy. But that the international community should respond to China when it does threaten intellectual property rights, or when it threatens cybersecurity. Like, I think that we need to intervene. The question is, though, I don't think that the United States should be forcing the international community to take sides between the two, because it's not, again, a Cold War, and locked in an existential struggle for freedom, is my point.
Well, I'm not entirely sure the case, especially under Z. If he's exporting um undemocratic practices, not merely interfering in democratic elections, but outright exporting practices. We are talking about surveillance technology to other undemocratic states, which can be, by the way, weaponized against US. Speaking of,
Sure,
Huawei controlling telecoms in Latin America and Saudi Arabia, where US does a lot of business. This is not safe for US business people and doing business in those countries. This is Russia is not a serious economic competition to the US. I don't think anyone would really argue with that outside, complete, maybe paid influencers online, but nevertheless, it has a very clear existential intention to destabilize and cause problems to the US. It is an ideological exploitation. This is not a
sure,
normal economic rivalry situation where you're just trying to project your economic influence and take control of the resources. This is quite ideological. In this case, I
sure,
am starting to believe this is also far beyond nationalistic desire to exercise economic control, and it's also turning very much into this level of ideological, anti-Western, existential behavior. I'm not saying that all of the CCP leadership feels that way, but the ones C has hand selected around themselves certainly do. So I'm not entirely sure we actually have a choice in that matter at this point. Maybe this was correct a few years ago, when he was in his years of power, but now his own attitude is becoming increasingly ideological and less pragmatic and less simply nationalism or economy based or competition. I'm not sure. this is this is where I'm conflicted, because I understand that if we are trying to separate economy from national security, then yes, it would make sense. Do we need to compete with China in every corner of the world on Solomon Islands? Probably not. But if
right.
the idea that China is literally interfering in US affairs and is not going to stop even if we leave it alone to control certain parts of the Pacific or Africa, this is a different problem we are facing now. This is no longer simply great power competition. This is an existential crisis.
But that's again, I'm not saying leave China alone because that's not the I mean, again, any country that violates international norms or international law should be held accountable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's my stance as sort of an internationalist and someone who has an internationalist vision of the world. But I do think that what's happening with sort of what you're describing is that China posing a series of threats, and I do think again it poses a series of threats in terms of its technology and democracy, again, violating human rights or allowing the violation of human rights of other countries. But the question is like, what is the United States going to do to respond to that? And I think then what you're going to see is what we're concerned about, which is that, well, the United States is going to go back to sort of having an interventionist foreign policy in various types, whether it's economically interventionist or militarily interventionist, or some type of like Cold War framework where the United States thinks it needs to be involved in every single country, where it seems that that communism is threatening it. I think that's an overextension of resources. Again, it creates a backlash within those countries, and it leads to, again, I think, long-term instability and potentially the deaths of many people. And I think that's the questions those are the questions we haven't answered. That sort of great power competition is like a way in which the United States is continuing its Cold War mission without calling it a Cold War because we're avoiding this framework. But I think even though, again, policymakers avoid the framework, but we're not in terms of like
Sure.
academics and policy and policy wonks. But I do think that you're onto something in the sense that, well, like, again, if you have a regime that is posing a threat to the world, then it should be that should be responded to. But I think China is not alone in this. There are many countries that should be held accountable, and what great power competition does is that allows the United States to pick and choose which countries it's going to do that to. The United States has sold arms to the Philippines, and when human rights violations were happening in the Philippines under Duterte and now under Marcos, like we've been silent on those things. Same thing with India, where we're cozying up to India and just allowing his ethno-nationalism and allowing the human rights violations and his manipulation of the courts to exist. And like, well, we're just allowed that stuff. That looks one contradictory to many people around the world, and they say, well, this is the United States just doing what it's doing in terms of its Cold War framework, and nothing's really changed. So, we're just gonna, not respect the United States and not sort of listen to the United States on these terms. And also, too, it potentially leads to, again, a backlash or some sort of blowback in various ways.
But what you are saying is that US should be more consistent in enforcing the law and principles, not that great power competition isn't in itself otherwise a problem. So this is an issue of the approach and enforcement, not necessarily the issue of the fact that um, this great power competition itself exists and it's real. And let's say, for example, if we were to put aside the Cold War framework, I'm not entirely sure that these countries that are competing with us would necessarily do so as well. I'm not sure there would be at this point reciprocity if we were to stop doing those things.
Well, not on every issue, but again, to me, the issues that are existential are like climate change, like
Hmm.
sovereign debt. These things are going to affect the health of regimes in ways that I think we have not yet understood. And so this is my point again. Like again, every issue being subsumed under competition has not allowed the United States or
To cooperate
incentivized the United
on.
States. Well,
Mhm.
cooperation, but also understand its priorities. Like the United States is just going to do everything everywhere all at once, kind of thing, in an effort to constrain China, and therefore we don't
I
have a
see what
strategy.
you're
We don't
saying.
have we don't have a purpose. We don't have a vision of what ultimately, again, the end of competition is. We're just going to do competition for the sake of it, and I think that
Mm.
is one, ignoring these problems that we're talking about, again, climate change and otherwise, and two, putting the United States in a position where it's just going to go and try to intervene in everything and do everything, and then ways that again have put us in, I think, in a position that's detrimental to our domestic security, but also in terms of our, how we think about treating and taking care of our people in the country who need help domestically, but also internationally might again create blowback or might backfire in ways that we saw during the Cold War. And I think that is the overall problem. And so I'll end with this point to say, like, the United States needs to rethink its role in terms of trying to pursue primacy around the world. I think that to me is the big issue, and it's the big issue for Van and I in the book. Is that's the first thing we say when it comes to solutions. That the United States needs to stop thinking that it can sort of pursue primacy to the ends of the earth, and rethink where, again, its priorities are and what it can do and what it can't do. To your point about agency.
Well, I'm not sure that the US is pursuing primacy around the world. That's precisely the problem. It seeks to constrain China, but not necessarily trying to become primary itself, which is why it's not really working. If you're not offering anything in return and merely trying to stop the other party, you're inevitably going to lose. Because when someone else has to offer something and you don't have anything to offer, who are they going to listen to? The person who's offering them something, however imperfect, or you. I mean, Africa is the is the prime example until now. U.S. has been half-heartedly propping up a few regimes here and there without really going full in to try to work out an arrangement that would really benefit the people of those countries. And meanwhile, China is offering concrete steps that we may
Sure.
not necessarily like. It may be crappy infrastructure that's overly costly with the low, doesn't help the local workers, but at least it's something that's not ethereal and consists more than broken promises and ideological demands and half-hearted and messy efforts. So US needs to figure out. I do agree that it needs to prioritize where it's going to put in efforts, but to the extent it prioritizes them, it needs consistency. It needs the sort of structure that China is willing to put in place. In some ways, we need to become more like China in that way, not in any other way, but in that,
I,
but
I don't know
in
about that, but I do think that the United States, I do. I mean, I think we just fundamentally disagree about the sort of um, pursuit of primacy. I do think the United States is trying to pursue primacy, even though the outcomes aren't leading to primacy. I think that's
Well,
also the
I here's it may be that let me put it this way. It may be that US thinks it's pursuing primacy, but it's not working out that way
Oh, I
because
see.
yes,
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it probably does think
yeah,
it's pursuing primacy, but to an outside observer, it's not
yes,
a very successful effort because to be
yes,
primacy, you have to be an economic power and there's an argument whether US has overstretched itself or spent the money in the
sure,
wrong way, and there's a very, very good reason to agree with a lot of this, but the final outcome, whether or not, no matter how you look at it, is that US positions have collapsed. They have collapsed in West Africa, in Latin America measurably. US influence is not what it used to be.
yeah,
And even among allies, by the way, that were happy with US influence for what it's worth. China is outspending US on military support in Latin America. That's a measurable fact. We're not talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about measurable, concrete influence. In the Middle East, Chinese companies are taking over businesses. They're taking over major projects.
yeah,
They're taking over cultural diplomacy, language that is Saudi students are studying Chinese in schools. We do not have that. English has used to be the only primary language of that sort. Now it's no longer the case. We are not. We are not keeping up. We don't have the same level of Chinese learning, so we can't even understand what our competitors are doing because we don't have the language skills
yeah,
to do that. So in that sense, I don't think we are measuring up to the primacy we are supposedly seeking.
yeah.
So
Yes,
even
I
if
agree.
we're just basically not measuring up is what I'm trying to say. And
Yes,
to the extent we are spending a lot of money, it's not being directed correctly
correct.
and it's not having the impact that it should for what it's worth.
Yes,
And it may be destabilizing in some ways because rather than creating enduring relationships based on things that would be appealing, natural appealing to countries that would work to us, we are pursuing a very haphazard imitation of the Cold War without the conditions that made it successful at more or less successful at the time, and certainly in today's world, they are a poor
mm,
fit for various reasons. So in that sense, I think I understand what
yeah.
you're saying.
That's right. Yeah, and I think to me, just briefly, I think great power competition is a way to pursue primacy, but not having the same effects as the United States had in the Cold War. It's a way of sort of continuing the mission, but within it, again, it's anachronistic for a multipolar era because you can't pursue primacy in a multipolar world and have the same results as you would pursue primacy and have the results that you saw during the Cold War. It's just not going to happen.
Well, it seems to me that China certainly looks to rebuild the world back into unipolar world that's under China's direction. Do you think it will have any luck with that?
No, I
Assuming.
don't. I don't
Mhm,
think I don't think any country can. I don't think the
mhm,
United States can or that China can. And this is why um again, I don't think that the United States um is in a position globally for all the reasons that you're saying to make the country be a unipolar power again. I also don't think China is in a position, certainly militarily, to rival the United States. Economically, it's think it poses again a significant challenge to American interests as they define them, as policymakers define them. But I think, it doesn't. It's not given again the various crises that it faces internally that it doesn't seem to me that it's going to be able to achieve unipolar dominance over the United States in the next 10 to 20 years. I think maybe in terms of sphere of influence in the South China Sea, that's a question maybe that it's more easily answered. But in terms of unrivaled global economic dominance, I don't see how that happens just in terms of the United States alone, but then putting in the other parts of the world, like again, China, India, sorry, in terms of being a predominant economic power. Access to strategic minerals in an age of technology and a race to sort of technological dominance, if that's how it's currently happening right now, like that's just not going to happen in in the ways that it had, that technology, those strategic minerals were important during the Cold War, but not nearly to the extent that they become as important now in the 21st century. And that allows countries to exert leverage over the international system in ways that they couldn't during the Cold War. And I think therefore unipolar, I mean, I don't think China has like a long game. I don't think like the Rush-Doshi analysis of China is correct. I think there are aspects of it that are correct, but I think for the most part, it's not correct. And I don't think, therefore, that given the ways in which both the United States and China have their own problems and then exist within a current international uh, framework of multipolarism, that you can see a unipolar era, come to be over the next 10, 15 years. I mean, I might be wrong. I can't see the future, but all the factors indicate that over the next 20, 30 years, there's going to be, three major powers in the world. It's going to be United States, China, and India. And it can't just be a situation where India is sort of stuck in between the three of them. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. Or it starts like being between the two of them. So I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think it's going to be much more multipolar and resource sharing, and we're going to have to figure this out. Otherwise, again, great power competition is going to doom us to a bad fate.
I'd like to end with one last point, which is a little bit provocative and
Sure.
controversial once again. There are some, not necessarily me, who are arguing that Trump is trying to do exactly what you suggested, to break
Yeah.
down the Cold War um, alliance-based approach to great power competition, to instead realign Russia, India, US triangle to try to constrain China and to try to kind of bring the Russia and India energy resources under the US umbrella, that Ukraine and Europe from that perspective, from US perspective, are irrelevant because they're eh, what are they going to do? Are they going to go be friends with China? No.
Mhm.
Um so US doesn't feel like it's a huge necessarily sacrifice in that sense. Not necessarily calculating the other cost of it, but putting that aside, that is apparently the maybe the approach. And if so, this approach is will upend this Cold War approach of bringing all countries under US umbrella or under the China umbrella. It's completely disregarding the countries that refuse to follow this framework almost.
Mhm.
How do you see this proposition?
I well, one, I don't think Trump thinks that. I think there are people around Trump who think they're doing that. Um, I to me see Donald Trump though as a creature of great power competition, in the sense
Hmm.
that what Donald Trump is just doing is redefining the terms in which great power competition is being waged.
Hmm.
Under the Biden administration, they thought they could do it smartly. They thought they could do it through export controls and tariffs, and try through things like the CHIPS Act and other legislation to outcompete China and antagonize China without provoking China in ways that would lead to some sort of crisis. And to a large extent, I think um, they fulfilled their goal, and they also came up significantly short, in the sense that they didn't really constrain China, but there were attempts at crises, were moments of crises, but attempts to avoid crises. But I don't think that in the long run they weakened China to any significant degree, or that they put China in a place where it's able to be less of a significant player around the world. So I think they failed in that regard. And Trump's kind of like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to weaken China. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to take over countries that, like, I'm going to take over Greenland, and we're just going to make Canada a 51st state, and we're going to put huge tariffs on Mexican goods, and we're just going to extract resources from various parts of the world, and that's going to be a way to constrain China, which is again what his people within the, I should say, be more too colloquial, I should say, his administration, the policymakers in the Defense Department all are focused myopically on China for the most part. And this is arguably what the Ukraine maneuvering is about. I think there are some people in the administration who think they're doing like a reverse Kissinger kind of move in like circa 1972. I don't think Trump has thought that out. I think Trump just thinks that Ukraine's a waste of resources for him. Um, um, and thinks that, I mean, he's cozied up to Russia and all the things that we already know, but I think also just in Ukraine, in terms of resources, he thinks it's a waste. I disagree with him obviously on that, but that's how he thinks Ukraine is. And then all the rest of the stuff that he's doing, Panama Canal stuff, things like that, is a way to build up American strength, economic strength, but sort of like it's assertive relationship or assertive position, and therefore its relationship to the world in better terms. Like I think that's what he thinks he's doing, and then that's going to constrain China. If you just take over other parts of the world, then okay, yeah, then China has less places to go for its own resources. I mean, and I'm actually being more sophisticated than I think Trump thinks about it. I'm thinking, I think I'm putting like a sort of a greater vision on it than I think he has. But I think that's where, if you put the two things together, that is Trump as a unpredictable, kind of somewhat even mercurial figure, someone who's like, goes back and forth, but has like sort of this idea of like ultimately the United States needs to reassert its power in the world and do so in various ways. Doesn't matter if you're an ally or an enemy. You combine that with the people who arguably are more thoughtful on this in terms of the defense establishment, defense establishment and national security establishment, and you see the connections. I think that the what's happening on this side of things, the personal stuff that Trump's doing, is connected to, in terms of the national security side of things, professional national security side of things, into an arguably, because again, this is up for debate, but in my view, a way to constrain China through new means. And I think that's also going to fail. It's already again failing as we're seeing, I think, because of again his abandonment of the tariffs and things like that. But I think that's what's happening as opposed to him getting out of the great power competition framework. I think that's really um, it, if there are people, if Pete Hegseth was saying like we need to focus less on constraining China in every domain and think more strategically about how we pursue and respond to China or deal with Chinese threats, then I would say okay, yeah, maybe that's happening, but it's not happening. Again, they're myopically focused on China, and then Trump sort of myopically focused on just resource extraction for its own terms. And I think again, you put those two together and you get a remaking of great power competition that we'll see how it evolves over the next 4 years, but that is still going to mean that whoever comes into office after Trump is going to be pursuing great power competition. If China is still the power that it is 4 years from now, going to be pursuing great power competition, even if it's in different terms.
Well, thank you so much for this really, really thoughtful discussion, and I hope our audiences not only take something away, but I encourage to read your books, not only the current one, but the ones you've published previously, and the one coming up soon. I'm certainly looking forward to that as well. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Michael Brenes, Yale University, and for those watching, we'll be back next Tuesday night, 9 p.m. as usual, the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.